Hello and welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm on my way to a lovely local Sunday car meet on the Sunday following Festival of the Unexceptional, because clearly the 1,200 cars that made it to Festival of the Unexceptional yesterday weren't enough for me. So I'm off to some more car stuff again today. The joy of having a bulk amount of annual leave so I can make the most of my weekends and the events that are on. So, as I said, yesterday was Festival of the Unexceptional, our very first ever Festival of the Unexceptional, and as with most people, the podcast this week is going to be about our experiences there. So we'd heard about how good the show was in previous years. However, we had not booked in. The tickets were released quite a bit earlier in the year, and it wasn't until Sunday night of last week that I posed the idea to Jamie about us going. Obviously recently we've got his Spitfire, and I suggested that we kind of book the Spitfire in, even though it was in need of a little bit of work and some spares that were on the way from the various Triumph Spares people. And if the work was done, then we could take the Spitfire, and if it wasn't, then Peggy was a fairly acceptable backup. And unfortunately, the spares were a little bit delayed in getting to us. The part that he needed was out of stock at one place and they hadn't let us know. So then it was a case of trying to track them down from another place. Anyway, that's not what we're here to listen to today. So we got the parts, but that will be what he's working on to get done for a future event. So Peggy ended up on Friday being cleaned up very, very quickly and being our steed. We set off pretty early on Saturday morning. It's not too far from us. We're really fortunate that with our location, we seem to be quite close to a lot of these sorts of things, and it only was going to take us about 40 minutes to get there. So we're really fortunate in that regard. But I'd seen the size of some of the queues and things that were there for getting in last year, and while they've moved the entrance this year, I thought if we get there a little bit early, we might not have the issue of sitting in the queue. Set off from ours about 5 to 10 to 8, stopped off for some fuel, and then it was kind of a truck up the A1 until we pulled off through to Little Bytham and into the Festival of the Unexceptional. And it was really nice that kind of a few miles out we started to be followed by some cars, and in Jamie looking through the rear view mirror was like, are they unexceptional? And they were indeed some unexceptional vehicles on their way. So we had a lovely little convoy over, which if you've listened to the podcast before, you know is one of my favourite things about those last few miles on the way to a big show. Following that, we were filtered in through a kind of 3-person system, which meant that we were mixed up from the people that we kind of convoyed in with, and ended up being just 2 or 3 cars behind Hubnut's Fairmont AU Betty, and I spotted it quite quickly from its very distinctive rear lights. And so managed to get some footage of us kind of following in a few of the cars, and it was nice that We weren't sat in traffic after that point. It was just a nice drive through the grounds of Grimsthorpe to the main display area. The time that we got there, I think we were probably all set up and parked up for about 9:30, if not a little bit earlier, which is the official start time. We got to Grimsthorpe not long after 9, and we were at the time maybe 2 or 3 rows from where they'd started parking people. So once we'd got ourselves nicely parked up and set Peggy up with her picnic blanket on display and the little sign in a window, and given a wave to Ian from Hubner and Carly and the dogs, we set off to kind of the 2 rows in front of us to gradually work our way up through the cars towards the concourse area as the cars were coming in. Now, as I said, it was our first festival of the Unexceptional, and I'd seen loads of pictures from previous years, so kind of had an idea of what to expect. But it really was something completely different to most car shows that you go to. The sort of cars that you find pulled out and brought to this show really are something completely different, and we were spotting some really interesting vehicles that I'd never seen before, I'd never heard of before, or cars that I was under the impression there wasn't that many of, but yet there was quite a few coming out of the woodwork. A particular favourite car of mine was a Hillman Avenger Estate in a gorgeous kind of tealy blue colour that had a beautiful green interior, bar one chair which he'd had to swap out to get reupholstered recently, and a green roof. And talking to the owner, it was one that he actually used pretty regularly, being quite a practical car for going to the hardware store and so on. But I don't think I'd ever seen a Hillman Avenger Estate outside of a museum before, despite growing up with kind of Roots cars and going to Roots car events. And then not only that, I saw several other Hillman Avengers and another couple of Hillman Avenger Estates, which was just brilliant to see. There was quite a few Renault 5s which we took some photos of and sent to our friend Dom, who's obviously recently got his Renault 5. But you kind of meander up through all of this, and there's so many kind of cars that you don't see at other shows, and you're also lacking cars that you typically see at lots of other shows. Peggy was the only Morris Minor saloon. Their 2 travellers turned up a little bit later, but it's usual that there's when you go to any other car show, you'd find loads of Morris Minors because they're so common. So it was quite unusual. In fact, I think it's probably the only show you're going to be outnumbered by Protons than compared to a Morris Minor. And it was just brilliant. I almost felt a little bit guilty for bringing a Morris Minor as such a common car these days that survived so well, because so many of these cars that we were seeing on display haven't survived in the numbers that so many of kind of the classics have, because they've been used and abused and then often ended up, unfortunately, in the scrappage scheme. There was also a great display of many Citroens. Again, something that I've spoke about on the channel is my love of Citroens that go up and down, and not only did I get to see so many one CX, quite a lot of BXs, a couple of DSs, but I also got to meet Rich from Up and Down Vids and see one of his BXs that was unfortunately quite a warm drive up for him. And that's the other wonderful thing about this event, is that it seems to draw in the large majority of Weird Car Twitter, and you're able to put quite a few faces to names. We wandered our way up through the cars that were arriving towards the concourse section, and managed to get to the concourse section and have a quick walk around some of that, which is where we found last year's concourse winner's owner, John, while his Black Knight was parked outside the concourse area with a plaque acknowledging that it had previously won. Not quite the fireworks, pyrotechnics and the picnic blanket from a Datsun Cherry that he'd been promised on Twitter the night before, but it was a suitably appropriate place for last year's very deserving winner, before it had to pass its crown on to the new winner later on in the day. And having not been there last year, I hadn't seen John's Black Knight ever, so in the flesh anyway. I've seen it on online, so it was great to kind of have a good look around there and look at all the wonderful little details that he's put into the car, like the pen and the bear and things that really caught our eye. The concourse area is obviously not what you'd find at any other show. You find such an interesting collection of cars in there, and cars that I'd never heard of, that were just presented so beautifully, and you knew that they were probably one of not many left that had been, and certainly probably the very best example left of the ones that there are. And some of them were in there in far better condition probably than they ever left the factory in. And it was wonderful to see so many people so passionate about these cars that they'd got such real memories with. After a wander round that concourse area, we started to realise that there'd been quite a few more arrivals. The area kind of behind where we were parked had filled up completely, and they were now sending cars down and past where we had started. So it was a case of walking down this way and trying to find some more interesting cars and working our way back up again. And there was so many lovely cars in this area that had arrived that little bit later, because they travelled that bit much further. Among them being kind of Katie, who's Wrenching Wench on Twitter, had brought two of her cars along. Again, cars that I'd seen online but not in person, and unfortunately I didn't get to meet her. Must have missed her at some point during the day, but it was fantastic to see the cars, and particularly her VW with its new steering wheel in place. Unfortunately, later in the day she had issues with the Audi and its radiator, but hopefully she had as good a day as we did that kind of made the stress of that worthwhile. A little walk back up to what I think they were calling Cortina Courtyard, where all the food was, to grab some lunch. The food options at this show were absolutely amazing. They had a great selection of several different food trucks, and the options that were available were really good, and the queues weren't too bad as well, considering just how big the event really was. They were getting through people really quite quickly. We went for some really tasty noodles, and then went and sat down with Steph, Joe and Fred to eat our noodles and just take the weight off our feet, because I think by lunchtime I'd already done my 10,000 steps on my Fitbit, and still had the rest of the day and more walking around to do. So it was nice to have a sit down and catch up with those guys. As we were getting up from eating our lunch, we spotted Ian and managed to catch up with him as well. He's got Fixing Assets here on YouTube, and we've not managed to kind of see each other at any shows this year, unfortunately, but it was really nice to catch up with him in person. And again, this show seems to be excellent for that, and it's one of those shows where for the first time in a while I felt like I had time to film and take the photos that I wanted, to talk to people, and also really take in the show and the atmosphere itself, because it's so well laid out. It's just about the right size. I suspect it's going to keep getting a little bit bigger and a bit more popular, because there is a little bit more space outside Grimsthorpe Castle that they could get a few more cars on if they wanted, but that's probably any much bigger than this, and I think you'll be far too exhausted to actually take it all in appropriately. Not long after lunch, we went and wandered around a few more of the cars, spotted some more later arrivals, and I went to kind of walk around some stuff and take some photos now that I'd pretty much put my filming camera away, and Jamie sat by Peggy, but a little bit away from her in the tree line, and it was really nice to hear that whilst he'd been sat there, there'd been a few people who had kind of come up and enjoyed Peggy, even though she probably wasn't what they were expecting to see there, and kind of taken in the little description that I put up in her window, which was really nice. And he said it had been good to see people interacting with the car without kind of realising that he was watching, in a non-creepy way, obviously. And so if you're one of those people who's joined us following, kind of seeing the car at Festival of the Unexceptional, thank you very much. I hope we can persuade you to follow or subscribe, depending on where you're listening to this on, and join the lovely little community that we're gradually building here on the Passenger Seat podcast. Now, whilst I'd been wandering towards the I think it's the Manor Park Classics stand, I'd heard from their speaker the voices of Paul Cowland and Charlotte Bowden, and I managed to work out that they were over on the kind of stage in Cortina Courtyard. So I headed that way to go and have a listen to them kind of having a talk with Mike Brewer and John, the owner of the Proton Black Knight, and it was really nice to kind of stand there and have a listen for a bit. It was Charlotte's first kind of time doing live stage interviewing, and it was really nice to see her doing excellently at that, and great to catch up with her after she came off the stage. I hadn't seen her since she'd done her big drive round the 4 points of the UK for charity, so it was great to kind of catch up with her following that. I'd had a little scroll through Twitter, and there was mention of a marina marquee behind the castle, and I hadn't really realised that there was anything behind the castle, so we'd gone for a little walk. There wasn't anything on in the marquee at the time, but it was nice to just have a little break and explore the gardens there, because you are at a really lovely location of Grimsthorpe Castle. We're fortunate enough to live quite locally, so we'd been there previously with the Singer Owners Club for a show last year, but it was really lovely to kind of have a chance to have a wander around the lovely rose gardens and topiaries and things like that, and there was a nice little bench where we were able to have a sit and rest our feet some more. Between kind of much earlier in the day when we'd gone around the concourse area, and then there'd been a few more concourse cars turn up, So we went back into the area directly in front of the castle for a look at those new arrivals. Before it was kind of getting towards the end of the day, and we all headed over to the main stage area to hear the announcement of the various winners. What was really nice about how they announced the winners is that there was lots of honourable mentions, and the announcer Danny Hopkins from Practical Classics made sure to kind of tell us all a little bit of a story about the various cars that were getting these honourable mentions, and it gave some really nice context to the cars that I hadn't known just walking around them. And that was really nice to kind of hear some of the quite exceptional circumstances a lot of these unexceptional cars had resulted in surviving in order to be there and at concourse on this particular day. The winner was a lovely Vauxhall Astra Merit that had come all the way down from Edinburgh, and was a real credit to the owner, and was just the perfect end really to the day. We had a kind of slow walk, tried to wave to a few people as we were heading back to the car to pack ourselves up not long after that, because we were really quite tired, and also we've got stuff going on with our bathroom at the moment, so we had to head back home to grab some clothes and things to go and make use of my parents' bathroom that evening. And yeah, it was nice. We had a little sit in the car and kind of watched a few people driving off for a bit. The car that had ended up parked between myself and Betty, the Ford Fairmont, had gone, so we sneakily moved Peggy over to get a picture of the two cars together, because they've been at a few shows together but actually never been parked next to each other in a way that I could have got a photo. So that was quite an unusual thing to have been able to achieve, I suppose. And then it was the drive home, which again for a little while was marked by the excellent aspect of being followed by several cars that were at the event. So yeah, that was our experience of taking Peggy to our first Festival of the Unexceptional. It was a really great day, and I highly doubt that it will be our last time at the Festival of the Unexceptional, and I suspect that we will be buying our tickets a little bit more early and eagerly next year, and perhaps even considering trying to take two cars along and loading them up with a few of our friends as well, because it's quite an interesting day, and I think even non-car people can really appreciate the sorts of cars that end up at Festival of the Unexceptional, because they're the sorts of cars that they might well remember quite fondly from their own childhood. In fact, we ended up parked a couple of cars down from a Citroen Xara Picasso, which I remember my parents having one of when I was maybe 8 or so. And whilst I'm used to seeing cars that used to belong to my parents at car shows, it's not typically the moderns that we had when I was younger. But yeah, if you're hesitating or thinking about whether you want to attend next year or make the trip, perhaps it's a little bit far for you, I'd highly recommend it. I suspect even if it moved next year to another location, although I really hope it doesn't, we'd be tempted to make a good trip of it over there, because it was such a fantastic day, so lovely to finally meet so many people and to see their cars, and yeah, just a really well put on event, well organised. They clearly work on in feedback and issues that have arisen from the previous year, such as kind of the getting into the show side of things, and that's really great to see with these sorts of events. They're not kind of stuck in their ways, they're ever kind of moving forward to try and make it as good of experience for everyone as possible. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've been watching on YouTube, I hope perhaps you've enjoyed the footage that I've put in for you as well of all the cars, so that you've got a glimpse of the sort of things if you weren't able to go along, or it's been nice memories for you if you were there at the weekend. But thanks ever so much for listening. In the meantime, drive safely and happy motoring.